Humanity was never weak, but that was not how the galaxy remembered it, and that misunderstanding began decades before the first shots were fired, back when the Orion Compact still believed power was measured only in visible fleets and loud empires, when the Galactic Council catalogued species by industrial output and territorial aggression, quietly slotting humans into the harmless category because Earth spoke softly, signed treaties quickly, and seemed content to trade, observe, and stay out of ancient rivalries, and the delegates from older civilizations nodded to one another as if the matter was settled, because humans did not posture, did not threaten, did not boast, and when asked about their military capacity, they gave numbers without drama and doctrines without poetry, all of it honest yet incomplete. And so the record showed a young species with moderate technology, high adaptability, emotional decision-making, and an unusual tendency to negotiate even when cornered, which the Council interpreted as fear rather than discipline, a mistake born from centuries of dealing with empires that only understood submission or defiance, never restraint. And the humans never corrected that assumption, not when patrols brushed too close to soul space, not when terrorists were quietly imposed, not even when the Kheran Dominion seized a human survey station on the edge of unclaimed territory and justified it as a clerical correction, because Earth responded with a formal protest, a request for arbitration, and a reminder of existing agreements, all written in calm language that made the Kheran admirals laugh in their scaled throats as they watched the message scroll across their command displays, believing they had learned everything they needed to know about humanity in that moment, unaware that the calm tone came not from helplessness but from habit, from a species that had survived itself long before it ever reached the stars, a species that had learned the cost of uncontrolled escalation through centuries of blood and ash on a single fragile world. And so when Captain Elias Rourke of the exploration cruiser Horizon received orders to withdraw from the contested region, he followed them without protest, even as his crew watched Kheran ships strip their station piece by piece. Because restraint was not surrender, it was policy, and policy was built on history the galaxy did not share. History that taught humans to document every slight, map every enemy, and prepare quietly while appearing compliant. And as the Horizon slipped back into human space, the Kheran Dominion expanded its claims, testing borders, seizing trade routes, pushing smaller species into vassalage, all while the Council debated semantics and enforcement timelines. And through it all, humanity continued to trade, to assist, to mediate, their diplomats earning a reputation as reliable and dull, their engineers praised for efficiency but dismissed as unimaginative, and their military officers rarely seen in council chambers because humans preferred civilian control and transparent command structures, another trait mistaken for softness, until the day a Kheran task force crossed a line drawn not on any public map, but etched deeply into human doctrine, when a civilian transport carrying refugees from the Virell system was intercepted and destroyed under suspicion of smuggling. Its black box later recovered by a neutral party confirming there were no weapons aboard, only families and aid workers, and the Council condemned the act with words that carried no weight, issuing sanctions the Kheran Dominion ignored, confident in its fleets and its political leverage. And it was then that Earth changed its posture, not with speeches or threats but with silence, a silence that unsettled those few observers who understood human patterns, because humanity had gone quiet before, during its own darkest chapters, when decisions were made behind closed doors and preparation replaced debate, and within weeks human trade vessels rerouted, embassies reduced staff, and joint research projects were suspended, all explained as logistical adjustments, while deep within Sol Command, analysts compiled decades of data on Kheran logistics, fleet behavior, command psychology, and economic dependencies, much of it gathered openly through exchanges the Dominion had considered harmless, because humans asked questions like curious students rather than hunters, and Admiral Sarah Okoye reviewed the reports with a steady expression, noting not just what the Kheran Dominion had, but how it thought, where it would overextend, where pride would override caution, because humans had learned long ago that understanding an enemy mattered more than outgunning them, and when the Council finally noticed a shift and requested clarification, Earth replied with a single statement affirming its commitment to peace while expressing concern for the safety of its citizens and allies, a message that satisfied protocol but carried an undercurrent the older species failed to hear, because they had never learned to fear a quiet human, and so the galaxy continued as it always had, confident in its hierarchies, unaware that a line had been crossed and that humanity, never weak, had simply decided it was time to stop absorbing blows meant to test them. The shift became visible first at the edges of known space, subtle enough that most analysts missed it, because human responses never arrived as grand gestures but as systems quietly rearranging themselves. And while the Kheran Dominion celebrated expanded trade routes and newly compliant client species, human ships began appearing in places they had never frequented before, not warships but logistics craft, surveyors, construction vessels, moving with purpose yet no announcement, laying infrastructure that looked civilian on the surface and defensive only to those who understood layered redundancy. And Captain Rourke, reassigned from exploration to what was labeled a stabilization task force, found himself escorting convoys through regions long ignored by major powers, delivering generators, medical supplies, and communications arrays to minor species that had learned to fear the shadow of Kheran patrols. And those species noticed something unsettling in the human escorts: a calm confidence that did not waver even when Dominion cruisers loomed nearby, because the human ships did not maneuver like prey. They held their vectors, their formations tight and disciplined, and when challenged they responded with clear, concise statements of intent backed by precise navigation data and legal references that left no room for escalation without exposure. And each time the Kheran commanders backed off, frustrated but unconcerned, assuming the humans were still hiding behind procedure, not realizing that procedure was being used as terrain, a battle space humans had mastered long before they mastered hyperspace. And at the same time Earth's industrial output quietly surged, not in the visible spike of war production, but in diversified manufacturing spread across dozens of systems, civilian yards producing components interchangeable with military platforms, research stations publishing innocuous papers that masked breakthroughs in energy efficiency and signal processing, all of it legal, all of it public, because humans preferred to hide nothing and everything at once. And when independent traders began to notice human freighters outpacing older designs, operating longer without refuel, adapting routes dynamically in response to threats, rumors spread that Earth had leapt ahead technologically, rumors the Council dismissed as exaggeration. Because if humanity had grown stronger, surely they would have announced it, demanded recognition, leveraged it. For influence, that was how empires behaved, and humans, in the Council's collective memory, did not behave like empires. They behaved like survivors, cautious and cooperative. And so when Admiral Okoye authorized Operation Halfline, framing it as a humanitarian protection initiative, no one objected, because the galaxy had grown accustomed to humans stepping in to help where others would not. And half-line stations appeared along contested borders, bristling with sensors disguised as weather arrays, defended by patrol craft classified as escorts rather than warships. And when a Kheran flotilla finally tested one of these stations, firing a warning shot meant to force compliance, the response was immediate and unexpected. Not an attack, but a system-wide blackout that crippled the flotilla's sensors and navigation for precisely 90 seconds. Long enough for human ships to reposition and transmit a single message stating that further interference would be interpreted as hostile action under existing accords. And when the flotilla regained control and withdrew, shaken but intact, Kheran Command blamed a software anomaly, refusing to accept that humans had reached into their systems without firing the shot, because admitting that meant admitting vulnerability. And vulnerability was weakness, something the Dominion believed only lesser species possessed. Yet across the galaxy similar incidents multiplied, human ships avoiding ambushes before they were set colonies, evacuating hours before raids, allied species receiving aid with uncanny timing, as if Earth could see threats before they formed. And within human space the tone remained unchanged, news feeds calm, leadership measured, no calls for revenge, no rallies or speeches, just steady preparation and quiet coordination, because humanity was not angry, it was focus. And focus, born of long memory and hard-earned restraint, was the most dangerous thing the galaxy had ever failed to recognize, as the Kheran Dominion, still convinced it faced a timid opponent, prepared a decisive move meant to finally force humanity into submission, unaware that in doing so it would trigger the phase humans had spent a century ensuring they would never have to rush. The decisive move the Kheran Dominion prepared was meant to be overwhelming, a display of force so excessive that resistance would seem irrational, and so a full battle group translated into the Virell system under the justification of enforcing security after the earlier refugee incident. Its admirals confident that a swift occupation would remind the galaxy of established hierarchies, because Virell sat astride several minor trade routes and hosted multiple non-aligned habitats that relied quietly on human aid, making it a symbolic pressure point, And when the first Kheran ships arrived, they found the system strangely empty of human presence. No escorts, no aid convoys, no patrols, only the stations and habitats going dark one by one as civilians evacuated along routes that had not existed on any public chart weeks earlier. And the Dominion commanders took this as confirmation of their assessment. Humans retreating when finally faced with real power, and they broadcast statements, asserting control while landing forces on abandoned docks, unaware that every evacuation vector had been calculated to draw the battle group deeper into predictable orbits, because human planners understood that force projection depended on momentum and pride, and they had given the Kherans both. And as the Dominions settled into the system, spreading ships to enforce their claim, the first anomaly occurred, not an attack but a delay. Hyperspace relays refusing to sync, supply tenders reporting misaligned coordinates, minor errors that force course corrections and consume time, all of it explainable in isolation, yet collectively disruptive. And back in saw Admiral Okoye watched the live feed with her staff, not issuing commands so much as confirming predictions, because the operation unfolding had been rehearsed countless times in simulations built on the assumption that humans would one day face an enemy strong on paper, faster in raw numbers, and so they would have to win by shaping the environment rather than contesting it directly. And when the Kheran flagship attempted to reposition to assert central control of the system, it found its path subtly constrained by debris fields that human tugs had arranged weeks earlier under the guise of salvage operations, forcing the massive vessel into a narrow plane where its escorts could not maintain optimal formation. And it was there, in that carefully prepared geometry, that humanity finally acted openly as a human task. Force emerged from controlled microjumps, their ships smaller than Kheran capital vessels, but moving with precision that bordered on unsettling, their weapons still cold, their transmissions clear, stating that the Dominion forces were violating protected humanitarian corridors and were ordered to withdraw immediately, and the Kheran admiral laughed, issuing a command to target the nearest human cruiser as a demonstration. But before the firing solution completed, the Dominion's fire control systems froze, overridden by code that rewrote priorities faster than organic crews could respond. And across the battle group the same thing happened. Not a shutdown but a reordering. Weapons locked to safe mode, engines throttled to idle. Communications rerouted through channel controlled by human ships. And in that moment the illusion shattered, because this was not jamming or sabotage but control, exercised calmly and selectively. And the human commander spoke again, explaining in simple terms that the Dominion fleet was being held in a non-lethal containment state, that no harm would come to their crews if they complied, and that resistance would result in progressive system degradation, not destruction, because humanity preferred outcomes that allowed learning. And for the first time in generations, a Kheran admiral hesitated, feeling something unfamiliar settle over the bridge, not fear of death but fear of irrelevance, of being outmatched in a way that rendered strength meaningless. And as the Dominion flagship sat powerless, surrounded by human vessels that had appeared from nowhere and now held everything in place, observers across the galaxy received delayed fragments of the encounter, enough to spark confusion and denial, because the idea that humanity had disabled a superior fleet without firing a shot contradicted decades of assumptions, and yet the data spread, undeniable and humiliating, while Admiral Okoye authorized the next phase, knowing the hardest part was not demonstrating power, but forcing the galaxy to accept that it had been there all along, unseen, because humanity was never weak. It had simply chosen when to stop letting others decide the terms of engagement. The aftermath of the Virell containment rippled outward faster than any formal announcement, because silence where victory should have been loud unsettled the galaxy more than explosions ever could. And as the Kheran Dominion scrambled to suppress reports, independent traders, automated relays, and neutral observers filled the gaps with fragments that told consistent story, human ships controlling space without dominating it, enforcing boundaries without conquest, and offering disengagement instead of annihilation, a pattern that confused older powers raised on decisive brutality. And within days a council convened an emergency session where representatives spoke carefully, choosing words that preserved dignity while probing for explanations, and Earth's ambassador, Lena Moreau, stood before them with the same measured demeanor humans had always displayed, acknowledging concerns, affirming commitments to peace, and calmly stating that humanity had acted to protect civilians and uphold existing accords, nothing more, nothing less. And when pressed about the technology used to neutralize the Kheran fleet, She declined specifics, noting that defensive capabilities were not a matter for public debate, a response that would have seemed evasive if not for the undeniable evidence now circulating, and as the session adjourned without resolution, fear replaced dismissal among several delegations, because they realized too late that humanity's strength had grown in the open, documented and shared, yet misunderstood because it did not conform to familiar expressions of power. And while politicians argued, human operations continued with quiet momentum, half-line stations expanding, escorts increasing their patrol ranges, and minor species finding that harassment ceased abruptly when human transponders appeared in system. Not because humans threatened retaliation, but because aggressors now calculated risk differently, and Captain Rourke, redeployed again, escorted a delegation of Virell refugees back to their restored habitats, watching as human engineers repaired infrastructure faster than Dominion forces had dismantled it, integrating upgrades that improved resilience without altering the character of the settlement, because humans believed protection should not feel like occupation. And among the Kheran Dominion, the psychological damage deepened, officers questioning command assumptions, crews whispering about invisible enemies who fought with patience rather than fury. And when Dominion leadership finally ordered a partial withdrawal to reassess strategy, it was framed as a tactical pause, yet everyone involved understood it was a retreat forced not by loss of ships but by loss of certainty, and in saw Admiral Okoye addressed her staff with neither celebration nor relief, reminding them that deterrence was not an endpoint but a responsibility, because revealing strength invited scrutiny and resentment, and humanity's challenge had only begun. As older powers weighed whether to adapt or test this new reality, and across human space citizens followed the developments with restrained attention, trusting institutions built over generations to act without spectacle, because humans had learned that survival depended not on proving dominance but on making aggression futile, and as the galaxy adjusted to that lesson, reluctantly and unevenly, one truth settled in, whispered in council halls and encoded into revised threat assessments, that humanity's greatest danger had never been its weapons or fleets, but its discipline, its memory, and its willingness to wait, qualities that ensured that when humans finally moved, they did so not out of weakness or rage, but with deliberate purpose that reshaped the balance of power without ever needing to announce itself. As the galaxy recalibrated around this new understanding, the most profound change unfolded not in open conflict, but in the quiet rewiring of assumptions that had guided interstellar politics for centuries, because once humanity's restraint was recognized as a choice rather than a limitation, every past interaction took on new meaning, and analysts across multiple civilizations began re-examining historical records, trade logs, diplomatic transcripts, and joint research initiatives, discovering patterns that now seemed obvious in hindsight, humans consistently positioning themselves at junctions of information flow, building interoperability standards others adopted out of convenience, offering mediation in conflict where data access mattered more than force, and investing heavily in redundancy, not just in infrastructure, but in relationships, and these revelations unsettled powers far older than Eve, because they suggested that humanity had not been catching up but preparing, and within the Kheran Dominion, this realization triggered a reckoning that threatened internal cohesion, as younger officers questioned doctrines built on intimidation and raw power, while elders clung to the belief that humans had cheated, that their control over systems was some anomaly that could be countered with enough aggression, a debate that paralyzed strategic planning at the worst possible moment. Because human policy did not wait for consensus, it advanced steadily, and Admiral Okoye authorized expanded information-sharing agreements with neutral species, providing defensive software updates and sensor calibration techniques that improved survivability without granting offensive capabilities, a move that further eroded the influence of coercive empires, as smaller civilizations discovered they no longer had to choose between submission and annihilation. And on the frontier, Captain Rourke witnessed this shift firsthand when a long-harassed trading coalition formally requested human oversight of its shipping lanes, not as conquerors but as guarantors, a role humanity accepted reluctantly and conditionally, insisting on transparency and local governance, because humans understood the temptation of empire and had designed their systems to resist it. And when council hardliners accused Earth of manipulating the balance of power under the guise of protection, Ambassador Moreau responded with uncomfortable clarity, pointing out that the balance had always favored those willing to exploit weakness, and humanity's actions merely reduced the incentive to do so. And as tension simmered, The Kheran Dominion made one final attempt to reassert relevance, launching a covert operation to disrupt human logistics networks through proxy actors, an approach that might have succeeded against a less patient adversary. But humans detected the pattern early, tracing financial flows and communication anomalies with forensic precision, and instead of responding with exposure or retaliation, they quietly isolated the proxies, offering amnesty and integration in exchange for cooperation, dismantling the operation from within and leaving Dominion intelligence blind and compromised. And when fragments of this failure surfaced, it became clear even to the most stubborn observers that humanity was operating on a different plane, one where power was measured in anticipation and control rather than conquest. And as months passed without escalation, fear gave way to grudging respect. New treaties reflecting updated realities were proposed, and the Council, reshaped by necessity, invited humanity into strategic committees once reserved for founding species, an offer Earth accepted with conditions emphasizing accountability and shared responsibility, because humans remembered too well what happened when power concentrated without oversight. And in quiet moments, Admiral Okoye reflected on the irony that humanity's greatest struggle had never been convincing the galaxy of its strength, but convincing itself to use that strength wisely, a lesson learned painful on a single world long before the stars, and now carried out with caution, ensuring that humanity's place in the galaxy would not be defined by domination, but by the simple, enduring truth that had finally become impossible to ignore, that humanity was never weak, only waiting for the moment when showing that strength would protect more lives than it endangered. The final challenge came not as an invasion or an ultimatum, but as a test of resolve disguised as diplomacy, when a coalition of older powers proposed a sweeping security framework that would limit autonomous defensive systems under the justification of stability, a framework clearly designed to blunt the very capabilities humanity had revealed. And for a moment the galaxy held its breath, expecting Earth either to reject the proposal outright and confirm its fears, or to accept it and quietly surrender the advantage it had earned. And instead humanity did something infuriatingly consistent. It agreed to the framework in principle while publishing a dense, transparent addendum outlining compliance methods that adhered perfectly to the letter of the agreement while rendering its restrictive elements functionally irrelevant through distributed architecture and shared oversight. A solution so elegant that it exposed the coalition's intent without accusing it, forcing signatories either to accept the logic or admit their own bad faith. And as the framework passed with amendments mirroring human language, it became clear that Earth was no longer reacting to galactic politics, but shaping them, setting norms that favored cooperation, resilience, and accountability, because those were the environments in which humanity thrived. And Captain Rourke, now commanding a multi-species task group, oversaw joint exercises that emphasized disaster response and interdiction against piracy. Watching former rivals coordinate smoothly under protocols humans had refined through centuries of multinational cooperation on Earth, and in those moments the real scope of humanity's influence emerged, not as an overlord but as a standard setter, defining what competent, ethical power looked like in practice. And within the Kheran Dominion the long-anticipated reckoning finally arrived. Leadership reshuffled under pressure from both internal dissent and external isolation, reforms implemented, reluctantly at first, then with urgency as younger leaders acknowledged that survival required adaptation rather than dominance. And when a restructured Dominion delegation approached Earth to negotiate renewed relations, they did so without bluster, recognizing at last that humanity's restraint was inseparable from its strength, and the talks that followed were difficult but honest, grounded in shared security concerns and mutual transparency, because humans believed that former adversaries, once confronted with reality, could become stable neighbors if given structure and incentive. And as agreements were signed and monitored under new verification regimes, the galaxy settled into a quieter era, not free of conflict but less prone to catastrophic miscalculation. And Admiral Okoye, preparing to step down after decades of service, addressed a new generation of officers, reminding them that the galaxy would continue to test humanity in subtler ways, through influence, dependency, and moral compromise. And that vigilance meant more than readiness to fight. It meant readiness to refuse power that led to easy dominance at the cost of long-term stability. And as human presence became an accepted constant across known space, woven into trade, security, and diplomacy, the myth of human weakness faded into a cautionary tale taught in academies and whispered among captains, a reminder that strength did not always announce itself with fire and banners, and that the most dangerous, species the galaxy had ever underestimated was one that understood exactly when not to use its power. The story reached its quiet conclusion years later in a way no strategist could have scripted, when a minor border dispute between two non-aligned species threatened to spiral into the kind of proxy conflict that once would have drawn empires and fleets, and instead both sides jointly requested human mediation before a single shot was fired, a moment historians would later mark as a true end of the old galactic order, because it signaled not fear of humanity but trust in its judgment. And Captain Rourke, older now, representing Earth alongside Ambassador Moreau, listened more than he spoke, guiding discussions toward shared data, verifiable limits, and mutual safeguard rather than punishment, and the agreement that emerged was unremarkable in spectacle yet profound in consequence, resolving the conflict without humiliation or force, reinforcing a pattern that had reshaped expectations across the stars. And back on Earth, Admiral Okoye watched the proceedings from retirement with a faint smile, knowing that this outcome had been the real objective all along, not victory over the Kheran Dominion or recognition by the Council, but the normalization of a reality where brute strength lost its primacy to foresight and cooperation, and as generations passed, the early days of underestimation became stories told in academies and cultural archives, analyzed with a mix of disbelief and admiration, because it seemed almost impossible that the galaxy had once dismissed a species so capable simply because it chose patience over posturing, and yet that lesson endured, shaping how emerging civilizations approach first contact, more cautious now, more curious, less eager to label restraint as weakness, and humanity continued forward not as rulers or saviors, but as participants, flawed, watchful, and deeply aware of the cost of power misused, maintaining systems designed to prevent any single hand from gripping too tightly, because humans remembered their own history too, well to repeat it on a larger stage, and in the end there were no monuments declaring humanity's rise, no grand battles marking its dominance, only a gradual, irreversible shift in how the galaxy functioned, one built on the understanding that the species from Sol had never needed to prove its strength through conquest, because it had always possessed something rarer and more enduring, the discipline to wait, the courage to restrain itself, and the resolve to act decisively only when doing so protected more lives than it destroyed, and that was a truth finally accepted everywhere from the smallest trade outpost to the highest council chamber, that humanity was never weak. It had simply been strong enough to choose a better way.